He served quietly, behind the scenes, no fame, no stars, just flavors passed down from a mother who once cooked on borrowed coal. The critics called it rustic, clumsy, uninspired. They barely looked him in the eye, until the motorcade arrived, until the president stepped into his kitchen, smiled, and asked for his table. That moment, frozen forks, stunned reviewers, rewrote everything. Because sometimes the world forgets, the hands that feed us often come from stories far richer than the ones printed on glossy menus. He drove the same route for years, silent, steady, invisible. To most passengers, Gerald Keller was just another tired face behind the wheel. They sighed at his pace, ignored his greetings, and never asked his name, until one morning when a uniformed sergeant stepped aboard, locked eyes with Gerald, and saluted. The entire bus fell silent. No one understood why yet. But in that moment, every assumption cracked, because sometimes the man you overlook is the one who once carried nations on his back and never asked for thanks. To set up 1,500 words, Gerald Keller's day began before the sun lifted its head over the concrete skyline of Hanover. He tied his boots with the same practiced rhythm he'd used for decades, first in a dusty barracks, then in silence at home. At 62, his back ached more than it used to, but his habits never faltered. The kettle hissed, the cup filled. He left precisely at 5:47 a.m., walking to the depot in a jacket that had seen better years. To his neighbors, Gerald was a quiet man, lived alone, kept a tidy yard. No one could recall seeing him with visitors, though some remembered an older woman who used to sit on the porch with him years ago. She hadn't been seen in a long time. The depot welcomed him with familiar cold, the clink of keys, the coffee too strong, the scheduler muttering about delays. Gerald nodded to them all, collected his clipboard, and stepped into bus 17, a worn machine with a stubborn left-turn signal. He knew its quirks better than his own reflection. His route looped through industrial zones and school streets, where tired faces boarded without greeting. Most looked through him, earbuds in, eyes down. On good days, a student would smile. On others, he was a steering wheel ghost. This invisibility didn't bother him. It protected him. Years ago, Gerald had worn a different uniform. He'd stood in places where silence meant survival, where names weren't always spoken aloud. He hadn't been a general or a high-profile officer, just a field sergeant, just the man others followed when orders got quiet. But that life was folded neatly away now, buried in medals, old photos, and scars. One afternoon, a boy in a hoodie tried to skip fare. Gerald didn't raise his voice. He looked at him long enough that the boy dropped the act and paid. It wasn't anger, just something in Gerald's stillness, an edge that didn't need sharpening. The other drivers noticed, but they didn't ask. A few suspected something about his posture, the precision with which he backed into the lot. But suspicions fade without stories, and Gerald never told stories. In the evenings, he cooked simply, read, watched the same news anchors he'd seen for years. Once a month, he visited a care home. No one knew why. The staff said he sat with a woman for an hour and never spoke, just held her hand. Back on his route, a new passenger had started showing up. Young man, buzz cut, duffel bag always tight at his side. Sat upright, said thank you each morning. Gerald nodded once, nothing more. But he remembered that stance, that kind of stillness. The city moved fast. Workers, students, tourists, people too busy to see the man holding the wheel. But in those quiet corners of each morning, the foundation of something deeper stirred. Because even invisible men leave echoes, and echoes have a way of returning when the world least expects it. The days that followed the critic's visit were quiet, too quiet for a kitchen that once echoed with laughter and sizzling ambition. Elias moved through his restaurant like a man condemned, not by a court, but by something heavier, public humiliation. The review had gone viral. A respected publication, wielding words like knives, had carved up his dream. Pretentious, dishes without substance, it said. More art than appetite. The chef seems to cook for mirrors, not mouths. Reservations dropped. Regulars disappeared. Some politely canceled. Others simply vanished. And though the lights still flickered on every evening, they now illuminated half-empty tables and a staff pretending not to notice. Elias had built this place from scratch. The floors, the wood panels, the menu, every inch was a hymn to dignity, heritage, and hard-earned skill. But now, all anyone saw was a failure, because one critic, perhaps having a bad night or bearing some hidden grudge, had decided Elias didn't deserve respect. Behind the scenes, the cracks spread faster, suppliers grew hesitant, investors raised eyebrows. One of the younger chefs, nervous about his own career, quietly slipped away with a vague text and no forwarding address. The kitchen staff still showed up, but they moved with unease. Each service carried the undercurrent of anxiety, of wondering if they were cooking for ghosts. Then came the emails, anonymous, snide, cruel, overrated, go back to cooking. For weddings, one simply read, pretending to be someone you're not always ends like this. Elias had grown used to pressure, but this was different. It wasn't just the business. It was something more personal, the suggestion that he didn't belong here, that a boy raised by his grandmother in a modest housing block outside Castle should never have aimed this high, that people like him don't get to wear chef whites embroidered with gold. The conflict sharpened not in one dramatic moment, but through 1,000 silent ones. The staff began second-guessing the dishes. Should they make things more familiar, more approachable? Elias resisted at first, then wavered. A perfectly balanced venison with juniper sauce was swapped for a safer duck breast. He removed the fermented rye foam that had taken months to perfect. It stung, not because it was his favorite dish, but because it meant he was beginning to believe what they said, that his vision wasn't worthy. Worse, his mother stopped visiting, not out of shame, but concern. She hated seeing him like this, eyes dimmed, voice cautious. You used to cook like it was prayer, she whispered one night, her hand brushing his arm. Now it's like you're apologizing. What Elias couldn't admit was that he was apologizing to every guest who walked in with doubts, apologizing for daring to believe that food could tell a story deeper than trends, apologizing for being from a place most chefs never brag about. He thought about closing, more than once. Not out of defeat, but because the silence was becoming unbearable. Not the silence in the dining room, the silence inside him. And then came the worst blow. A group of diners, clearly from a nearby consultancy firm, requested a private table. Elias personally curated the evening. Slow-roasted lamb shoulder, elderflower glaze, root vegetables grown from his cousin's garden. But midway through the meal, he heard one of them laughing, loudly. The words drifted in through the half-open kitchen door. Can't believe we paid for this. No wonder he got wrecked in the Times. Another voice chimed in. Didn't know the art school dropout was still pretending to be a chef. Laughter, utensils clinking, wine being poured with arrogance. Elias didn't flinch. He only stared at the plate in his hands, a dessert crafted from childhood memory, walnut tort, quince jelly, a hint of goat's milk ice cream. He thought of his grandmother, of her wrinkled hands guiding his, of the way she used to say, "Our past is seasoning, not shame." He didn't send out the plate. Instead, he stepped outside the kitchen for a breath of air. The cold wrapped around him like truth. Inside, the critics were winning, not just the ones with pens, but the ones who'd always watched him with narrowed eyes, those who thought class, accent, or background was reason enough to doubt someone's value. He returned, said nothing, and finished the night. The next morning, his sous chef found him early, cleaning the coffee machine. No music played, just the quiet rhythm of a man trying to hold something together. You don't have to prove anything to them, she said softly, but you can't stop proving it to yourself. It wasn't meant as a speech, but Elias heard it like one, and something shifted that evening. He walked the dining room himself, not because he wanted to, but because he had to. The guests were polite but cold. One asked if the chef had changed. Another mentioned the bad review casually, as if offering sympathy to someone terminal. And then, something strange happened. An elderly couple, seated near the window, asked to speak to the chef. Elias went, half expecting more veiled disappointment. But the woman, with silver hair tied in a loose knot, touched his arm and said, "That tasted like memory. We haven't had herring prepared like that since our wedding night." Her husband smiled. "You reminded us who we were. It didn't erase the pain, the headlines, the insults. But it reminded Elias why he'd started. Why, as a boy, he'd watched his grandmother mash root vegetables with hands full of stories. Why he believed food could heal something deeper than hunger. But the pressure didn't lift. The critic's words still hung in the air like smoke, and a larger challenge loomed. One more test of dignity, identity, and faith in his own voice. The president's visit hadn't happened yet. That moment was still coming. But Elias was already facing the real battle, the silent erosion of self-belief. In the face of public doubt, Friday morning dawned with drizzle, a thin mist clinging to windshields and muting the city's sharp edges. Gerald arrived at the depot like always. Same boots, same route sheet, same nod to the scheduler, who barely looked up. But something was off, a subtle tension in the air. A few glances between dispatchers, a black SUV idling across the lot, not transit branded, not familiar. Gerald noted it without staring. His face revealed nothing. Bus 17 hissed to life. The morning route began. Rush hour passengers shuffled on, umbrellas dripping, coffee clutched tight. Gerald greeted each quietly, as always, and received little more than grunts or distracted glances. At stop 4, the same teenager who'd posted the mocking video boarded with friends. He made a fake military salute and chuckled under his breath. Gerald looked at him just for a second, then focused forward. The bus rolled on. At stop 8, the young man with the buzz cut reappeared. He looked leaner, paler, moved with care. His duffel rested differently now, as if heavier. Gerald's eyes met his in the mirror. The young man nodded once. "Morning, sir." Gerald's nod was slower this time. He didn't look away quickly. At stop 12, it happened. As the doors opened with a metallic gasp, a figure stepped aboard, tall, composed, in full formal Bundeswehr uniform. The passengers fell silent, not out of respect, at first, but confusion. Why was an officer stepping onto a city bus? He didn't sit. He walked down the aisle, scanning each row, stopping near Gerald. And then he saluted, sharp, measured, formal, to Sergeant Gerald Keller. He said, voice firm, "Feldkommando 12, retired. I rode under your command in Kandahar, and today, I ride under your watch once more with gratitude." Silence turned dense, every rustle stilled. Even the teenager with the mocking salute looked stunned. The officer remained upright, salute unwavering. Gerald's eyes, for the first time, shimmered not with pride, but with something deeper. He didn't return the salute right away. He didn't have to, because those who lead well never need to declare it. The officer stepped back and stood quietly beside the buzz-cut young man, his duffel, now clearly marked with medical transport tags. Only then did Gerald nod once, deep and full. The rest of the ride was different. Passengers sat straighter. No one filmed. No one whispered. At the next stop, an older woman reached for her wallet and handed Gerald a folded note. She didn't speak, just touched his shoulder. The man who once mocked him got off without a word, eyes downcast, and when Gerald pulled into the final station, the supervisor was already waiting. But this time, the black SUV was parked beside him, and out stepped a higher-ranking officer, with medals visible even beneath his coat. He shook Gerald's hand in front of everyone. "Forgive the surprise. This was long overdue." From the back of the bus, the buzz-cut soldier rose, limping slightly, and turned. "I didn't want my last ride to be under anyone else's watch. Sergeant, thank you for all of it, and for the first time in years." Gerald spoke loud enough for everyone to hear. "You always had the strength. I just reminded you where to find it." The twist wasn't just about Gerald's past. It was about how little people knew of those beside them, how history can ride buses, mop floors, carry groceries in silence, and still hold nations in its memory. Because true strength doesn't perform. It remembers, waits, endures, and, when the time comes, it stands not for applause, but for principle. After the salute, after the handshake, after the final stop emptied and the engine wound down to a hush, Gerald Keller sat alone behind the wheel of Bus 17. The depot lights flickered above, pale and indifferent, But inside the cabin, something had changed, softened, not just in how others saw him, but in how he carried the silence that had once been armor. The officer didn't linger. There were no press conferences, no grand announcements. He simply nodded one last time and left, leaving only the echo of acknowledgement behind him. It was enough. Gerald never wanted fanfare, just truth. Back at the depot, the supervisor approached again, his posture different this time, less dismissive, less certain. He shifted from foot to foot. "I didn't know," he began. "None of us did." Gerald gave a small shrug, not out of indifference, but understanding. "You weren't supposed to." The supervisor hesitated, then extended his hand. "Still, we owe you. Not just for today." Gerald shook it, then climbed down from the bus with quiet grace. He didn't ask for reassignment, didn't demand apology. But from that day forward, no one questioned the routes he drove. In fact, new trainees started requesting ride-alongs with him without being told to. They noticed how he handled corners, how he read people, how he waited. Exactly 3 extra seconds for the elderly woman with the floral cane who never rushed. The teenagers no longer mocked. The ones who used to roll their eyes now held them still when he passed, uncertain but aware. Even the woman who filed the complaint approached him weeks later, visibly awkward, to offer a polite nod and a mumbled thank you. Respect isn't forced. It's earned in moments that go unnoticed until they don't. The young soldier, the one with the duffel, kept riding for a while longer, his limp gradually easing. Gerald never asked what his injury was. He never needed to. But on his last day in town, the young man left a note folded under the seat. "I was afraid I'd forgotten how to stand tall. You reminded me, not with words but by just being there." At home, Gerald made one small change. The box under his bed, the one filled with medals and shadows, was moved to the shelf in his front hallway, not as a trophy, not to impress, but as a quiet truth, finally allowed to breathe. The neighborhood, too, seemed to see him differently. A few neighbors began waving. Someone asked if he needed help clearing snow. Children pointed and said, "That's the soldier driver." Their parents corrected them, "That's Mr. Keller." Gerald never corrected anyone. He just smiled. More often, on Sundays, he kept visiting the care facility, not just to sit now but to speak. A few residents remembered him, some didn't. But he read aloud, sometimes brought flowers. The staff said his presence helped calm the veterans with memory loss, like some part of their past recognized him even when their minds couldn't. The final echo came quietly, months later. A plaque appeared in the break room at the depot. "In quiet service, some carry more than we know." To Gerald Keller, whose silence held strength and whose journey carried us all. He never commented on it, but he was seen standing before it once, just before the morning rush, his cap in hand, back straight. Not every story ends with medals or cheers. Sometimes the greatest victories are invisible, dignity reclaimed, truth revealed, respect quietly restored. And Gerald Keller, he just kept driving, because some men don't need a stage to matter. They only need a road and someone, finally, willing to see who's behind the wheel. In a world that often rushes past the quiet ones, this story reminds us to slow down and look again. Not every hero wears rank or demands applause. Some carry their service in silence, in daily routines, in the steadiness of showing up. Gerald Keller didn't need validation, but dignity deserves recognition, and sometimes it takes just one moment, a salute, a nod, a truth revealed to remind us of the quiet strength we overlook. If this story moved you, take a moment to reflect on someone in your life who may have been unseen for too long. Leave a comment below with one word that captures what Gerald represents to you. Perhaps it's respect, or word, or simply seen. And if someone comes to mind while watching this, share this video with them, because sometimes the story we need most is the one we never saw coming.